uh, no nation can ever be financially stable unless the external and internal security environment is stable. Therefore, to bring about economic stability, it is very important that you have a strong military and armed forces. And particularly for a nation like India, you need strong armed forces because we've got belligerent neighbors on our northern and western borders. Especially with the COVID-19 situation that we are going through, you need sustainable economies, but yet you also need strong defense forces. And if I may quote from the words of our foreign minister, and he said, fashioning a robust response to COVID-19 challenge is set to dominate global diplomacy in the 21st century. The world has also seen strong reactions to globalization. Much of it arises from unequal benefits between and within societies. The world after COVID-19 will be multipolar, pluralistic and rebalanced. And India with this experience will help make a difference. And I unquote. Well, militaries too need to adapt to challenging times and transform their concepts and techniques of warfighting. And therefore the focus must shift on technology. Today, as we see, the world has moved into a new and unsettling geopolitical phase. Rising powers are contending for new roles and seeking to reshape the rules that govern world order. The world seems to be returning to an era of great power contestation and conflict, even as global strategic uncertainties like trade rebalancing, standoffs, deglobalization, regionalism, climate change, transnational terrorism, popular protests, and trade wars continue to loom large. We are witnessing seismic changes in geopolitics shaped by a nation-first approach and economic rebalancing on the center stage. And therefore, as I talk about militaries, I dare say that militaries across the world today must be capable of visualizing beyond the horizon and appreciate the role of technology in shaping our military doctrines and concepts. Dynamic changes are clearly visible in hybrid, hyper or grey zone warfare. The global environment is mixing commercial and military technologies into military applications. This kind of change is becoming imperative, but somehow people resist change because they focus on what they stand to lose rather than what they will stand to gain through transformation. Industry today is establishing intelligent, that is to say, autonomous, intelligence-based knowledge analysts, interconnected, that is, trusted communications and synergistic systems, distributed, that is, ubiquitous sensing, decentralized production, democratized science and technology, and finally, digital systems. Militaries therefore also need to adopt to similar approach if military leaders are to conduct precision warfare, not necessarily with kinetic force, but one that disrupts the opponent's observe, orient, decide and act cycle, which is popularly known as the OODA cycle in the military. Now, hiding behind the veil of confidentiality, militaries around the world have often failed to take advantage of the success made by the civilian industry in developing state-of-art technologies that can be put to dual use by the military. Therefore, present-day concepts of warfighting are being redefined. The major focus must therefore be on imbibing technology, and needless to say that future battles may no longer be won with big armies, but with armies that have succeeded in harnessing cutting-edge technology into warfighting machinery. Time has come for the Indian military to therefore have a look at their organization and structures. No discussion on technology would be complete if we do not understand the nuances of disruptive technology. The term coined by Professor Clayton Christensen in his 1997 bestseller, The Innovator's Dilemma, characterized any new technology in two segments, either sustaining or disruptive. Sustaining technology is gradual development of existing technology, while disruptive technology does the opposite. It revolutionizes the field. Going deeper into this would imply that industrial revolutions initiated technology innovations and their applications, subsequently went on to disrupt the established world order or trade practices. Colloquially, therefore, when applied to defense services, disruptive technology can be defined as a set of technologies applied to a relevant problem in a manner that radically alters the symmetry of military power between opposing forces and then outdates the policies, concepts, doctrines, and organizational structures of the adversary. This forces change in strategy adopted by military, and those who fail to change can only repent at leisure later, having failed to accomplish their assigned missions. Disruptive technologies like autonomous vehicles, fighting platforms, artificial intelligence, robotics, big data analysis, quantum computing, blockchain technology, 3D printing, nanotechnology, or directed energy weapons will have a significant impact on 21st century warfare. Archimedes once said, "Give me a lever long enough and I will move the world." Though such a lever has not yet been developed, the explosion of disruptive technologies is considered to be the lever that will indeed move the world. Nations, and along with them militaries around the world, are facing the impact of cyber technology. In the Indian military, we are witnessing major disruptions in exploiting technology because of threat posed by cyber warriors. Unless we overcome these threats, we will find ourselves cocooned in space, denying ourselves the benefits of technology. Well, on the flip side, there is always an argument that if we are lesser technology dependent, we will also be lesser prone to cyber attacks. But should such an analogy prevent us from imbibing technology? We must, in fact, invent better technology to stay ahead of our adversaries. Innovative process by which creativity is applied to every facet of any organization or any organization's value chain is the better way of creating value. Therefore, there is a very thin line between disruption and innovation. Disruptions are innovations, but not all innovators are disruptors. There is a key difference between the two. Whilst both act to destabilize the status quo, the effects of disruption and innovation on any organization or society are very, very different. Disruption can be defined as displacement of an existing technology, or it pushes an existing technology to take a step backwards. It is an act that leads to a systematic change, whilst innovation usually has more positive connotation and is connected with upgradation. Innovation is seen as a rational process, whilst disruption is considered as defying unpredictability, irrational and damaging. Emergence of digital cameras, for example, or mobile phones, replacing wired phones through innovative, however, caused disruptions and significantly changed the concept of interpersonal communication within the society. No talk on technology would be complete without identifying the relevance of artificial intelligence. It is seen as a simulator of human intelligence processed by machines. AI has also led to the advent of unmanned autonomous systems that are man-made but are capable of executing operations by means of advanced technologies without much human involvement. The recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh witnessed the effect of unmanned aerial vehicles, which are normally performed by manned aircraft and missiles. Are we therefore moving into a domain of robotic warfare? Well, no robo can replace the mind, Yet robots will augment the physical warfighter in the field and in providing logistic support. How much and how many, only time will tell. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would say that it is time for the armed forces in India to transform, to reform, and to perform. And with that, I would say that if we do not imbibe technology in the armed forces, we may not succeed in our missions in future. Therefore, the time has come to, rather than banking on human resources, we start banking more on technology by empowering the soldier, sailor, and airmen who has to deliver in combat. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And with that, I am open to any further discussion on the subject.
Yeah, just 5 or 6 questions for you, General Rawat, since you have sort of set up the entire conversation so well and through this research piece. We're also talking about, of course, the strategic dimension to Atmanirbharta. So, General Rawat, how close are we to becoming a force which is self-reliant and perhaps indigenized to the point where our dependency on expensive imports will be over?
I think if we look at the country, look back at our nation when we got our independence, we did have a good defense industry. However, over the years, we relied exclusively on the capabilities of our DPSUs, our ordnance factories, and the sole inventor of research and development was the DRDO. But I think now times are changing. We have seen the manner in which the automobile industry revolutionized the way in which we are now moving around in swanky cars and other things that we have. Look at the way the IT industry revolutionized. Who brought in this industrialization? It all happened with the private sector. And I think now if we start looking at facilitating the private sector in bringing in good technology within, whether they collaborate with some foreign OEMs, but start developing everything that we need for our defense purposes in-house, I think that may be the way forward. And that is what we are trying to do, is to support the Indian industry in developing products for our military. That will help us in 2 ways. One is that we will be able to give a push to the Indian industry and let them invest in research and development. At the same time, we will also throw a challenge to our own research and development organization, the DRDO, and the DPSUs and ordnance factories, because they will now have competition that they will have to face. And when there is competition, you find that the products improve. And I think with that, we may be able to achieve our mission of Atmanirbhar Bharat in defense manufacturing.
That's very interesting, because there is obviously a large domestic audience that also believes that organizations like the DRDO, etc., should be encouraged and reformed rather than making them compete with organizations from the private sector. I mean, we know there's that conversation, but let's focus a little away from that also on infrastructure development, which has turned out to be so very vital now, especially in our experience with what we've seen at the border with China, for instance. Obviously, we need to build infrastructure there. We also need to develop our ports to counter China's string of pearls sort of expansionist outlook. How are we placed in both these endeavors, both at our borders and at sea?
Yeah, I think there are 2 issues that you have raised. One is the development of our border infrastructure, that is the land borders, and then you're looking at the maritime domain. If you look at the border infrastructure, you're obviously comparing with our northern neighbor, China.
Yes.
Now, China has a terrain advantage over us. You know, they are on the Tibetan plateau, where the altitude, the base altitude is anything between 12,000 to 13,000 feet. And then they have to come up to the Himalayas, which are at 15 to 16,000 feet. So you see that from the Tibetan plateau, coming up to the Himalayas, they are only negotiating a gradient of about 4 to 5,000 feet. So they have a terrain advantage as far as development of infrastructure is concerned. If you look at our thing, from mean sea level, you know, that is along the valley floor, you have to then rise to 16,000 feet over a distance of 200 kilometers. And these are the Himalayas, which are young mountains, which are prone to disruptions. Therefore, I think development of infrastructure for us has been a challenge. But I think in the last 4 to 5 years, there has been a flip from the government side, and you will find that our border infrastructure development funds have increased, not only just for developing our military infrastructure, but also for the civilian infrastructure. So I think we are now able to keep pace with what the adversaries are doing on the other side. We have not yet caught up with them, but time is not far when we should be able to catch up. I mean, I would say the Chinese have almost achieved what they wish to achieve. Maybe in the next 2-3 years, they would have achieved every area where they want to develop our roads. But we have also given a flip to this, and we should be able to achieve our targets in the next 3 to 4 years.
So the time frame is 3 to 4 years.
Yes, that's right.
Let me take this a little forward. We don't have much time also. But the Chinese are expanding, not just threatening our border regions, but also, of course, in the South China Sea. They're moving into the Indian Ocean region aggressively. How does India counter that? We've talked about the land dimension, but how do you defend against an enemy that is also coming in through the sea?
Indian Ocean is not India's ocean. This is an area where 70% of the world's trade moves, through merchant ships and what have you. Large part of the oil reserves or all requirements of the countries in this area passes through this region. Therefore, if any nation has to confront India in the Indian Ocean region, I don't think India will stand isolated. India will automatically get support of nations which are also using the Indian Ocean for their trade and other issues that are there. So I don't think we need to get completely overwhelmed by what the Chinese are doing. Chinese are developing their naval power not just for the Indian Ocean region. They are aspiring to become a global power. So whatever they are trying to develop as far as their naval resources are concerned, it is for domination of the globe as a whole. They want to reach out to nations. They have invested in Africa. They have invested in the Americas. They have invested in the Southeast Asia. So they've got to now protect all their investment. And for protecting their investment, they have to use the sea route. And therefore, they are developing their navies for that purpose. And I don't think we should get so concerned about it. Let us also not forget that the way the Indian peninsula projects into the Indian Ocean region, I think it gives us a tremendous advantage because we are able to naturally dominate the Indian Ocean from our land borders along the coastline. At the same time, we are also blessed with island territories on our east and west coast. We've got the Andaman Nicobar Islands and the Lakshadweep Islands. If we can develop these islands into islands of resistance, I think we should be able to keep our adversary at bay by not just dominating from the oceans, but also developing and creating bases in these island territory of ours, whether we develop them for seaborne assets or we launch them for the foodborne assets, the military assets, in the air domain, in the, I would say armed forces as a whole. If you look at it from that perspective, I think we should be able to take care of our interests. Talking about South China Sea, again, we are looking at Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific is again being developed for free movement of trade in this area. It's being to ensure that the stocks are free of any intervention. So once again, you find that there are nations which are coming up together with India to ensure that there is free movement of trade and traffic that happens along the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific. So we do have this advantage because of the kind of trade that moves in this area. I don't think we will ever get isolated in the Indian Ocean region. It will not be our sole responsibility to defend everything that happens in the Indian Ocean region. We will be developing some kind of coordinated approach with the other nations.
Well, one grouping that is coming together is the Quad. We've just had summit-level conversations. And I just wanted to ask you, do you ever see it sort of developing into a NATO kind of alliance directed at perhaps China? Or will it have a larger role, which is perhaps more economic, more trade-centric, more about defending, larger issues and defending greater ideas like democracy, etc.?
The Quad should not be seen from that perspective. The Quad is a arrangement between nations which want to ensure free movement of trade through the Indo-Pacific region. So therefore, nations are coming together to ensure that no single nation is able to dominate this region along the seas. So I don't think there is a need to look at it from the military perspective or against a particular nation. It is just that a group of nations want to ensure that there is free movement of trade, because as I said, large part of the trade of any nation moves through this area. And we all want security of our trade, we want security of these locks. So this arrangement is actually coming from that perspective. I don't think it has got anything to do with the military angle yet to be given to this arrangement that is there. And Quad is therefore more of an alliance only for, I wouldn't say alliance, it's a cooperative mechanism to ensure free passage of trade and so that these locks are not interfered with by any particular nation or a group of nations. I don't think it has got anything, it is not even a semblance of NATO, nor will I see this emerging as a NATO in the future.
But some of the stakeholders would like to see this perhaps being targeted at China. Do you think that is something that India should sort of join in with, or do you think we should retain a degree of strategic autonomy and say, look, there is no point in getting into a confrontational sort of mode with the Chinese?
Not that if we join any alliance or we create anything here is going to lead to a confrontation with China. I think what we should be concerned about is our own strategic autonomy. We've always maintained our strategic autonomy. We must continue to do so. And therefore, what we wish to do, how we wish to collaborate with nations, must depend on our own strategic freedom of action that we wish to, which we've always been very proud of. And I think that is the way forward.
I just want to quickly also touch upon a couple of issues. You've been talking about modernizing the forces, integrating command, making it a leaner fighting force. How far down the road are we? Are you also encountering any obstacles and hiccups?
Well, in my preamble, I did mention that there is always a resistance to change, because people tend to only remember what in the short term they are going to lose, and they forget what in the long term they will stand to gain. I think world over, if you look at the militaries, everybody is integrating. There is no way one single service today can fight a war. You cannot say that the Air Force alone will say, I will be able to defeat the adversary should they throw a challenge at us. Or the Navy will say, I alone will dominate the Indian Ocean region. Or the Army will say, I alone can defend the land borders. It is not going to happen that way. You have to integrate the resources. You have to develop capabilities in a manner that the combined strength of our armed forces becomes more than the sum of the whole. And that is what we are looking at. We have, we look at our landmass. We've got one landmass and there is a airspace over that. Now to defend that airspace, you need an air defense structure. Now you can have loosely integrated structures, or you can have a structure which controls everything that uses the airspace. Today we are only looking at the Air Force and civilian aircraft using airspace. But we are seeing there are more and more users of airspace. You see the drones, the unarmed combat vehicles that are now coming in there. There are the artillery weapon systems which are becoming with longer ranges. You have missiles which are going to be using the airspace. All these need to be integrated. You can't have air forces doing combat in the air and artillery and missiles just being let loose in the air. Who's going to control them? You need one agency to control them. So therefore the airspace management, you need one agency, and therefore we are trying to say, we are calling it defense. Because we are dealing with defense. The militaries deal with defense of the nation. So we are therefore calling it an integrated air defense command, which is going to control all the users of the airspace. That is one thing we are looking at. Then we find that we have the Indian Ocean region. We've got the Navy, which looks after the Indian Ocean region. You've got the SINCAN, that is one of the commands that we created, integrated command, which is the Andaman Nicobar command, which does not report to the Navy. It reports to the CDS. Or the IDS, as I may say. So it's supposed to headquarter IDS. So you've got loose systems operating in the seas, in the high seas, following different chains of command, reporting to different people. So we feel that the entire Indian Ocean region must be controlled by one entity. And who is best capable of controlling the Indian Ocean region is the Navy. And then you have land borders. Now you have a border with your northern neighbor, you have a border with your next western neighbor. You can say that the borders can be controlled by one agency. We feel that you need to create integrated theatre commands for your northern borders and for your western borders. You take the example of the 1971 war. You fought the war in the east, in East Pakistan for the liberation of Bangladesh, and there was a battle going on the west. How much control was being exercised by the headquarters here? Eastern Theatre was being controlled by Eastern Command, with General Jagjit Singh Arora and his Chief of Staff and all his corps commanders controlling that battle. And you had a Western Theatre and General Harbaks was controlling the Western Theatre. How much say did the army headquarters have in that? Well, you can say, what did the army headquarters do? Well, you know what General Shyam Manekshaw did. He did the strategic planning process. He was dealing with the various government institutions to find ways of means of combating the war. So he was giving a single point advice to the government as to how we should fight the war. And thereafter, the war fighting was left to the respective theatres. So therefore, he was one person who was looking at a whole of government approach being adopted towards war fighting, which is what we will have to do in the future wars. And then the war fighting physical execution of combat being left to the theatre commanders, with resources being made available to them, with trained manpower being made available to them, ensuring that they get the logistic support on time. So I think the headquarter element here, which is the central headquarters located in Delhi, whether it's the Army, Navy or the Air Force, will get more concerned about planning, strategic planning, ensuring whole of government approach, making sure that the field formation commanders or the theatre commanders are resourced correctly, they are given the adequate logistics that support that they need, but they have relative independence to carry out their war fighting because they have the best knowledge of terrain. Yes, you will require them to be given some surveillance capabilities which are centrally controlled so that you know what is happening around you. But thereafter, once you have given them the complete, you have made a strategic plan, execution is best left to the theatres. So it happened in 71 war, and that is what we are looking at, creating land-based commands for the northern and the western borders.
So you'd said that change obviously is resisted. Where is this resistance coming from?
Well, resistance comes from the fact that in our armed forces, you have a army which is the largest, then you have the Air Force and you have the Navy. Now, when you see such a large army, obviously the other two services have a feeling that we will get usurped by the army and that the army will take over everything and will finally control everything that we have. I think that is a myth which should be dispelled because, as I said, each service has its own potential and capability, which we have to identify. What the Air Force can do in battle, the Army or the Navy cannot do. What the Navy can do on the high seas, the Army and the Air Force cannot do. So each one will have its own charter. They will have their own roles and responsibilities based on their strengths. And I think we need to capitalize on the strengths of each service to make sure that we integrate, yet we ensure the autonomy of each service, single service, remains. So I think that is something which was what was being resisted all these years, but I think that has now been overcome and the services are now moving together. They have understood that change is for good and that it will happen and it must happen.